The 14th of November, the wind carried the sound of boots long before the soldiers appeared. In the small clearing, surrounded by rusted wire, the women froze. They had heard rumors, whispers, that the American guards had changed their orders. 4 days, rations had stopped coming, and the camp doctor hadn't visited once. A voice shouted in English, followed by the translator's harsh tone. "Line up. Outside your quarters. Bring nothing." A cold chill spread through the group of Japanese women prisoners. Some of them had been nurses, others factory workers, wives and daughters, taken during the Pacific Front's collapse. Now, they were just numbers marked on faded uniforms. Among them was Aiko Tanaka, a woman in her late 20s, her eyes dark with exhaustion. She had spent 3 weeks in this camp, long enough to see how fear could turn humans into ghosts. She looked toward her younger sister Mina, clutching her arm tightly. "What do they want this time?" Mina whispered. Aiko didn't answer. Her throat was dry, her heart beating so fast it hurt. When the American guards appeared, they weren't shouting. They walked in silence, their expressions unreadable. The interpreter's voice echoed again. "You will remove your outer clothes." Gasps filled the air. One woman fainted. Even Ico's knees buckled slightly. Mina's grip tightened. In that moment, every story they'd ever heard, every nightmare of revenge, humiliation, and cruelty flooded their minds. The women obeyed slowly, trembling hands clutching their thin garments. But then something unexpected happened. A soldier stepped forward, tall, blonde, with a medical armband on his sleeve. He spoke softly to the interpreter, who looked confused, then translated. "You are not being punished. You are being checked for infection." For a moment, no one moved. The silence was heavier than the sky itself. Then, the soldier gestured toward a row of wooden tubs filled with steaming water. Another guard carried buckets of soap and clean cloths. It wasn't a punishment. It was a disinfection process. The realization didn't come all at once. Aiko stood frozen, still waiting for cruelty to fall upon them. But the guards looked away respectfully, keeping distance, as female medics, American nurses, entered with masks and gloves. They began helping the women wash carefully and gently, as though tending to wounded patients. Tears welled in Ico's eyes. It wasn't because of the warmth of the water. It was the shock of being treated as human again. One nurse noticed her hesitation and smiled faintly through her mask. "You'll be fine," she said softly, her accent heavy but kind. "We don't want anyone getting sick. You've been through enough." Aiko didn't understand every word, but she understood the tone. It wasn't cruelty, it was compassion. Around her, other women began to relax. Some even cried openly, letting the water wash away the grime of fear and hunger. It was the first time in months they had felt clean or safe. Afterward, clean towels and new uniforms were handed out. Plain, gray, but soft and warm. The same soldiers who had seemed so terrifying minutes ago now offered bread, broth, and blankets. Aiko sat on the wooden step outside the hut, her sister beside her, steam rising from their bowls. She still trembled, not from cold, but from disbelief. "Why would they do this?" Mina whispered. Aiko stared at the distant horizon, where the sun began to fall behind the barbed fence. "Maybe they don't all hate us," she said quietly. In that fragile silence, the fear began to fade, replaced by something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. But deep inside, another thought began to form. If these men could show kindness, what did that mean about everything they had been told during the war? Were the monsters they feared just men like them, scared, tired, and longing for peace? As the night grew colder, Aiko looked up at the stars. For the first time, she didn't pray for the war to end. She prayed that when it did, people would remember this the day they expected humiliation, and instead found mercy. And somewhere near the gate, the blonde soldier glanced toward the women's huts, his expression unreadable, his eyes filled with quiet guilt, as if he, too, couldn't quite believe that kindness was still possible amid the ruins of war. That night, Aiko slept for the first time in weeks, not peacefully, but without fear. The night was colder than usual, and the air carried a heavy silence that even the crickets dared not break. The women sat huddled together in the dimly lit room. Former nurses, clerks, and villagers, now reduced to nameless captives. Some whispered prayers under their breath. Others just stared blankly at the wooden floor, trying to escape the fear that clung to the walls like humidity. A voice outside barked an order. Boots stomped. The metal door creaked open. Everyone, stand up. The translator, a young Japanese man who had joined the Allied side near the war's end, repeated the command with trembling lips. The women rose, confused and afraid. The American sergeant, who entered, didn't look cruel. He looked tired. His uniform was dusted with sand, his eyes sunken from sleepless nights. Behind him stood two nurses wearing Red Cross armbands. For a moment, the women exchanged nervous glances. What was happening? The sergeant gestured to the interpreter again. Tell them, he said quietly, they're to be inspected for wounds, for lice, for diseases. When the words reached the women, they froze, their faces drained of color. One of them, a former schoolteacher named Aiko, shook her head in disbelief. No, she whispered. We cannot. But the soldiers waited. The Red Cross nurses stepped forward gently, holding blankets and medical kits. It's for your health, one of them said softly, though none of the women understood the language. Still, the tone, that calm, feminine tone, was different. It wasn't harsh, like the voices they'd heard in the camp before. Reluctantly, the women obeyed. They were led behind makeshift screens, one by one, as the inspection began. Each heartbeat sounded louder than the next. Outside, the sergeant turned away. He didn't watch. He lit a cigarette and stared at the gray sky. He had been told to follow orders, to make sure the POWs were healthy, to prepare them for transport. But as he heard the muffled sobs from behind the curtain, he clenched his jaw. This war, it broke everyone, he muttered under his breath. When it was Ico's turn, her hands shook so badly that one of the Red Cross nurses had to help her unbutton her torn uniform. The nurse, a woman named Clara, spoke softly, her voice like a lullaby. It's okay. You're safe here, she whispered, even though Aiko couldn't understand her words. But somehow she felt them. Clara examined the bruises, the cuts, the marks of starvation that traced Ico's fragile frame. Then she handed her a blanket, warm and soft, something Aiko hadn't touched in months. Tears filled her eyes. Arigato, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Clara paused, recognizing the word. She smiled faintly. You're welcome. Outside the tent, the sergeant exhaled deeply. The night wind carried the smell of salt and fire. Somewhere, artillery still echoed in the distance, reminders of a world that had lost its sanity. But inside that small inspection room, something human was returning. Hours passed. When it was over, the women were allowed to sit again, now wrapped in donated blankets. They looked at each other in silence. No one spoke. Yet something unspoken had changed. They were no longer just captives. They were human beings again. The interpreter finally broke the silence. You will be moved tomorrow, he said softly, to a camp near the coast. It will be safer. Safer. The word felt foreign. That night, Aiko couldn't sleep. The candlelight flickered beside her, casting shadows on the wall that looked like ghosts of the past. She remembered the last time she'd seen her village. The laughter of children, for brother's farewell. The promise that he'd come back. He never did. A single tear slipped down her cheek. Outside the window, Clara stood quietly. She didn't know why. She had come back to the barracks that night. Maybe out of guilt. Maybe out of compassion. She looked at the sleeping women and whispered to herself, they're just girls, not soldiers, just girls. The next morning, the trucks arrived. The women climbed aboard, clutching their blankets tightly. As the convoy moved out, Aiko looked back one last time at the camp where she had thought her life would end. The gates swung open, and in that moment, though her future was uncertain, one thing felt clear. She had seen kindness where she least expected it. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to hope. The road ahead was long, and the memories of war would not fade easily. But as the truck rumbled toward the coast, Aiko looked up at the rising sun and whispered something that no one heard. Maybe the world can still heal. And somewhere far behind, the sergeant stubbed out his cigarette, staring at the same horizon. He didn't know why, but for the first time since the war began, he felt the same thing too. The trucks rattled over the rough dirt road, carrying their silent passengers toward the coast. The morning mist, hung thick in the air, blurring the horizon where land met the sea. For hours, no one spoke. Only the growl of the engines and the occasional cry of a seagull broke the stillness. When they finally stopped, the women stepped down, one by one. Before them stretched a camp, unlike the one they had left behind. Barbed wire still stood tall. Guards still walked the perimeter, but the smell of salt water and pine trees replaced the stench of burning wood and oil. Aiko took a deep breath. For the first time in months, the air didn't choke her. A young officer stood waiting, his uniform crisp and his expression calm. He gave a brief nod to the translator. "Tell them they'll be treated fairly here," he said. "They'll work, they'll eat, and they'll be safe." The translator's voice trembled as he repeated the words in Japanese. Some of the women exchanged cautious glances. Safe was a word they no longer trusted. But as they entered the camp, they noticed small things that felt different. The barracks were wooden, but clean. There were windows that let in sunlight. Buckets of fresh water stood neatly lined up, and the kitchen smelled faintly of soup. Real soup, with vegetables and rice. Ico's stomach tightened at the scent. It reminded her of home, of her mother cooking during the New Year festival, before the war had taken everything. Later that evening, when the women were seated around the mess table, a guard walked in with a crate. Inside were neatly folded uniforms, not military, but plain blue dresses, each paired with sandals. "There for you," said the translator. The women looked at one another, uncertain. Aiko hesitated, then took one of the dresses in her hands. It was soft, clean. She couldn't remember the last time she had worn something that wasn't torn or filthy. As she held it close, she felt tears sting her eyes again. She turned away quickly so no one would see. That night, after dinner, the camp grew quiet. The sound of the ocean waves rolled in like a slow heartbeat, steady and calm. For the first time in months, Aiko lay on a real bed, not the cold ground. The blanket smelled faintly of soap. C stared at the ceiling and whispered, "Thank you," to no one in particular. But someone heard. Outside the barrack, an American guard named Daniel paused. He had been assigned to watch over the women's compound that night. He wasn't much older than Aiko, maybe with tired blue eyes that seemed older than his years. He had lost friends in the Pacific, men he'd trained with, laughed with, gone in seconds. But now, standing outside this quiet camp, watching the moonlight fall over the sleeping women, he felt something shift inside him. War had taught him to hate, but compassion had slowly crept in to fill the cracks. The next morning, Daniel brought a crate of oranges to the women's barracks. It was part of their new ration supply. The women looked at the bright fruits in disbelief. For months, they'd eaten only rice water and stale bread. Aiko reached for one timidly. She peeled it slowly, and the scent filled the air. Sweet, tangy, almost heavenly. When she looked up, Daniel was standing at the doorway, watching quietly. Their eyes met, just for a second, and both quickly looked away. But something small, unspoken, passed between them. Later that day, when the women were taken to the camp garden to help plant vegetables, Aiko saw him again. He stood by the gate, giving instructions through the translator. His voice was firm, but there was no anger in it. At one point, Aiko stumbled while carrying a bucket of water. The heavy pail splashed across the ground, soaking her shoes. She froze, expecting punishment, but Daniel stepped forward instead, crouched beside her, and helped her lift the bucket. He said something soft, reassuring, though she couldn't understand the words. Still, his tone said enough. "Diajubu," she murmured. "I'm fine." He smiled faintly, recognizing her tone, even if not her language. From that day, small acts of kindness became part of their strange, silent friendship. He'd leave extra bread near the kitchen door. She'd quietly fix his torn glove with a piece of thread. They never spoke directly, but their gestures said more than words could. One afternoon, Aiko found a folded piece of paper near her workbench. On it, drawn in pencil, was a small sketch of a seagull flying over the ocean beneath it. A single English word, free. She didn't know who had drawn it, but she had a feeling. She was going home, to rebuild, to remember, and perhaps to forgive. Years later, long after the war had become history, an elderly woman in Tokyo would show her granddaughter a small, worn button. "He gave this to me when I was leaving the camp," she'd say softly. He was the man who reminded me that even in war, there can still be kindness. And though the world would never know their names, their story would live on. Not in history books, but in the quiet places where humanity survives the ruins of war.